For over 35 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we want to examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Rebka, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start in the eastern Ukrainian city of Chasiv Yar. This city has been heavily contested for the past 8 months now, and the Russian soldiers have uncovered an especially interesting and remarkably innovative yet also quite a desperate method to shield themselves from the ongoing daily Ukrainian drone attacks in the region of Chasiv Yar. We are looking at the footage, and it's quite unique because it shows us here that the canal in Chasiv Yar, let's recall that back then, the canal district of Chasiv Yar was also first captured by the Russians. That this channel is partially above ground, specifically in these thick pipes here, which run across the city. Very soon, we're about to see that, quite astonishingly, the Russians have somehow managed to find shelter within these pipes. These are essentially their makeshift barracks, serving as their regular living quarters for several weeks and even months, where they make efforts to protect themselves from the relentless and ongoing Ukrainian attacks. And that's why we see these holes that have formed everywhere. They weren't there 6 months ago. And now we see time and again how Russian soldiers are moving into these pipes, then out of these pipes, and traveling from there to other positions. Their attacks lead, here we can see it relatively well, so the Russians are actually living inside these canal pipes. At this moment, there are 2 soldiers who are making their way in, entering the area specifically to practice further attacks from that position. There we see it too, more Russians are moving here, and we can also see that the pipes have meanwhile been tunneled under. That indicates they're making an attempt to get underneath it, and they've strategically dug trenches beneath these pipes to minimize exposure to Ukrainian drones as effectively as possible. However, of course, the Ukrainians have been keeping a close eye on this situation for months and are now responding by attacking the Russians with new and more advanced types of drones. Instead of using these classic kamikaze drones, grenades are actually being strategically thrown into these holes and occasionally beside them by the Ukrainian drones. Now we see it once again. Here are the video recordings. They attempt to determine where the Russians are, identify when they enter these areas, and subsequently, they throw grenades into this above-ground channel. And try to, if you will, flush the Russians out, thoroughly forcing them from their accommodations, barracks, and the opportunity they seized. You can clearly observe them attempting to seek shelter here. A noticeable hole is already present in this pipe, and then the shell overshoots the intended target by several meters. Nevertheless, these are the attempts and endeavors of the Ukrainian army in Chasiv Yar indeed to hinder and stop the Russians in their formation and grouping for carrying out further attacks and offensives within the city limits. Let's quickly take a look at the map and see that these pipes, these large above-ground pipes here, are very conveniently positioned for the Russians. Namely here, we've marked them. These are the pipes that run diagonally through the city. The canal quarter was the first to be captured by the Russians. That was already last year. Kalinina was also taken by the Russian army. And the video footage that we have just recently seen has all been sourced from this specific area. This means that the Russians are attempting to establish a foothold in this area and are continually launching new attacks in a westward direction towards Chasiv Yar. And if we look at the situation within the city itself, we see about 2/3 under Russian control. You can quite clearly see the street area of Chasiv Yar here, although the central area is still firmly held by the Ukrainian army. And in addition to that, there are some dacha neighborhoods situated further southwest of the city. We're now going to take a look at Maisky on the same map again, because of course the Russians are also making efforts to advance in Chasiv Yar. On one hand, we just saw these desperate attempts where people flee into this channel and from there try again and again once they've gathered themselves as a group of 5, 10 or 20 to continue advancing westward, but also with the Russian Air Force. We are about to view some footage here showing the bombing of Maisky, executed by an Su-34 aircraft belonging to the fleet of the Russian army. And these recordings are consistently crucial to capture, allowing us to observe that there is a simultaneous assault occurring on the ground, such as these infantry attacks. Those exact same meat attacks, but indeed also utilizing very modern possibilities. Here we see it once more, this UMPK rack that's attached here to what used to be known as the FAB free-fall bomb. This adaptation or mechanism effectively transforms these bombs into quite precise and reliable tools. Now we see the impacts in Maisky. Not entirely sure what was supposed to be hit there. It's possible that they all missed the target, but it's also quite plausible that Ukraine had constructed a trench system in that location, which may have then been spotted by the Russian forces and was targeted, and indeed was the objective of this FAB 500 airstrike. All things considered, the ongoing battle for Chasiv Yar persists. This conflict has actually been raging since May of last year. The Russians advanced at a slow pace, initially capturing the canal zone and subsequently progressing further westward from there. Nonetheless, this city, quite different from Kurakov, for example, further south, is not being abandoned by Ukraine. Trust me, you truly have to battle for every single meter before gradually pulling back. And when we talk about Krakow, we can directly move to the region. We have new material indicating that the Russian army is making further progress advancing westward of Kurakove. The material is unfortunately of quite poor quality, yet I hope it's clear that this involves artillery fire on large buildings, specifically buildings in Dakhna. Dakhny, another location I personally had the opportunity to visit last September, is situated around 5 kilometers west of Kurakov. We can now observe that precisely the fact that the Ukrainian army, now we see the Russian soldiers here, that the Ukrainian army is probably firing heavy 155mm artillery at the large buildings in Dakhna. Once again, this indicates that they have withdrawn several hundred meters from this position, if not potentially several kilometers, and are strategizing to make the Russian advance within Dakhny as difficult and costly in terms of losses as they possibly can. However, these buildings are undoubtedly quite distinctive, and it becomes very clear that the Russian soldiers take refuge in them for cover, after which you can clearly see the Ukrainian artillery launching attacks on these structures. Buildings, for example, like this one with the red roof here in Dakhne, and this shows us that even in Kurakove it was not the end, that it wasn't the end of the Russian attack efforts, but rather that one is attempting to push further toward the west from here. Let's take a look at the map. We see that west of Kurakove a kind of, not an encirclement, but a very dangerous situation has emerged again, where the Russian army has already advanced relatively far in the north, has advanced far in the south and in the middle. Dakhny is still standing there, trying to hold it all together. We see about half of the place now under Russian control, the other half still under Ukrainian control. The situation remains fluid. We are currently assuming, based on the provided observations, that it's steadily moving further westward. And what's even worse for the Ukrainian army is that the Russians have already established a foothold in Andrivka here. Andrivka, a larger place. About 2,000 inhabitants before the war. There were still some people living there in September because they were around 15 kilometers away from the front line at that time in September. Now, approximately 4 months later, we are witnessing the front having moved towards Andreevka for the very first time. That signifies we have the initial outskirts of this location under Russian control now. Nevertheless, about 3/4 of the place remain under Ukrainian control, and towards Andreevka, you must bluntly state it because beyond that point, there's nothing more left. It truly is the last place where resistance can occur beyond fields and forests. In that regard, it's crucially important for the Russians to seize control of this place because afterwards, the Ukrainians would have absolutely no point of contact left whatsoever. Next to it, we also see Ulakli, which is another small village. Here is another small village marked that is not named, but we can see these are all just very small road systems. That means they are really tiny villages with formerly 100, maybe 500 inhabitants at most. And the whole situation would become very difficult for Ukraine to establish defensive lines if they were to lose Andriivka. It is not yet the case, however. The dynamics in this specific front section are relatively clear. From Karakov, we progress onwards to Velika Novosilka, another small town Ukraine unfortunately lost just a few days ago. Once home to 5,600 people, but strategically crucial in the southeast of the front. And here we have new footage showing us that the 110th Brigade of the Ukrainian Army is now deploying the M109. Self-propelled howitzers, if you will, supplied by the USA, to shell Velika Novosilka from a distance. And it's not just the location that's interesting here. We're talking about Velika Novosilka being shelled, as we'll see shortly, and also the manner in which the vehicle is being utilized. Initially, we had for a long time, seen the shoot and scoot strategy, where the Ukrainians quickly move their howitzers to the front, fire quickly, and then swiftly move away again. Also, the 155mm artillery with a range of 20 to even 30 kilometers. However, this worked so poorly because the Russians were so well prepared with their drone superiority, utilizing their surveillance drones, their partially kamikaze-type drones, and also their large missiles that were then subsequently launched. That a different strategy is now used here, namely one buries oneself, so to speak. That means these artillery guns, we see them here, are deeply buried in the ground. You're underground, have stored the ammunition, and then constructed a solid bunker system around it. We frequently see, once again, particularly these nets right over here. These are, of course, a specialized type of chain link fence that has been strategically put in place here to, in theory, function as a countermeasure against incoming Russian kamikaze drones. And it's quite intriguing that we notice this new strategy that cannons are buried deep, probably at the maximum range from the current front, and from there, here we see it then, by pulling this rope at the back, fires the device and targets the next area. And this area is shown here in material also from the 110th Brigade. It is indeed the location of Velika Novosilka, where we can see the complete and total devastation across that entire area, and now we are witnessing the artillery impacts in the center that we have just seen a moment ago. Unclear what was hit here, however we can review it in the latest footage shortly. The Ukrainians now say this was their target. They aimed somewhere and destroyed this building which was occupied by the Russians. In the last recordings we can see it quite well once more. This is the sports stadium of Velika Novosilka, where the Russian army posed proudly with the Russian flag about a week ago and made it clear that this place has now also been brought under control. Once again, the Ukrainians managed to escape at the last second. After all, it was accomplished. We discussed the near encirclement from which the Ukrainians managed to escape at the last moment. And now they truly have no other choice but to relentlessly bombard this city, much like Krakow and many other previously lost cities, from a safe distance using artillery, rockets and drones. Talking artillery, the Russians continue using their artillery heavily, and in this instance we observe a quite similar strategy, as we can see that Russia has taken measures to bury its artillery as effectively as they possibly could. This here, the whole thing is an artillery position. Here we can see the camouflage net. Down below we can clearly see the barrel of this artillery piece, which is visibly sticking out, most likely oriented towards the western direction. We can also spot Russian soldiers active over here. And the Ukrainians are of course also trying to target these artillery gunners. We now see them firing. By utilizing their own artillery, this approach is referred to as counter-artillery. So you look carefully at where the enemy is. You either have radar systems or drone systems which then target the respective Russian artillery in this case. And here we observe that after 3 direct hits, a catastrophic explosion of the ammunition within this particular artillery piece occurs, which had been strategically buried there in position. Since the start of the war, it's obviously been a relative advantage for Ukraine because it possesses a range edge with its 155mm artillery pieces, because it can simply shoot up to twice as far as the 122mm, which we see here. And thus, it has an advantage. The Ukrainian guns are hard for artillery on the Russian side to hit. However, from other weapon systems, as we just mentioned, here are additional systems, in this case D-20, that are also buried and very well secured. And we see that the Ukrainians are now using their FPV kamikaze drones here. That means they do this actively, and it's now a key part of modern counter-artillery strategies. It's not just about their artillery, they also use kamikaze drones to effectively target specific systems. And once again, it's this noticeable range advantage, as just mentioned a moment ago, approximately 20 kilometers range with the 122mm artillery of the Russian army. And that is roughly about the same range capability that the FPV drones possess on the Ukrainian side. This means that nowadays, as we've seen again in the past months, one is capable of handling both the Degree rocket launchers and to effectively target and engage at least the artillery guns that are of a lower caliber with their custom FPV kamikaze drones. We'll stay briefly in the east of the country to take a look at another Ukrainian attack, this time on a high-tech system of the Russian army, namely a Buk M3. An anti-aircraft system that was spotted right here by a Ukrainian drone. Here we can see it in the movement back and forth or in the ongoing repositioning within the target area. The Ukrainians seem to have identified it based on its look. It is an exceptionally modern system, indeed the most advanced jamming system available that you could possibly imagine. With this, you can shoot down planes up to 15 kilometers high and also within a relatively large radius. And at this point, we are seeing that the Ukrainians have once again succeeded in approaching with an FPV drone and have managed to directly attack this specific Buk system. Whether it was completely destroyed remains unclear here. We don't see, for example, the rocket fuel exploding, but we definitely see an explosion on the ground and see that the system itself is also smoking now. That means we definitely have the situation here. We can mark it. This represents the system, and maybe you can see it here. The smoke is emerging from about this point. We have the system that was definitely hit, where the soldiers are now retreating as well, and the Ukrainians are very proud of it because it's extremely important. In recent days, we have repeatedly observed numerous drone attacks occurring against Russia on Nizhny Novgorod, on Kazan, on all the oil refineries there, and naturally the initial layer of air defense that the Russians have established is within Ukraine, within the occupied territories. And so, of course, the occupied territories must first be flown over by the drones, at least in many directions, before reaching the Russian airspace. And from there, they can continue flying up to 1,000 or 1,200 kilometers partially towards the mainland. Another advanced system with a cost between 25 to 30 million euros was at least targeted and hit by Ukraine. However, we are unable to ascertain the precise outcome or effects of this attack from the available material at this point. Let's head to Ukraine's southwest. The war between Russia and Ukraine rages on there too. especially focusing around the significant Dnipro River, which serves as a key marker. The Dnipro River is the main river of Ukraine, clearly dividing the landscape between the Russian-occupied regions and those areas held firmly by Ukrainian forces. And on this river, there is quite a lot of combat action taking place, including various military activities. We're observing one of them at this moment and witnessing something entirely new to us, namely the mining operations of the river by the Ukrainian military forces. We see here that a Ukrainian small boat, a speedboat with a rather large engine mounted on the back, is approaching very slowly and very cautiously towards the Russian-held line or the Russian-held shore. Very soon we'll be able to see the footage from some individual soldiers. Now let's pause it completely. Here we are able to see it. A lone soldier, I hope he's visible enough here, is putting a mine into the water. That means, yes, he's carefully placing a mine in the water. The mine submerges and remains beneath the water's surface. That means it's no longer visible for this camera here either. The soldiers also don't see it, so yes, they weren't allowed to drive there anymore. But they are the only ones who know where this mine was placed. The boat is now continuing along this line and is laying more mines at the mouth of a smaller tributary of the Dnipro. We can see it now. The next mine is being carefully placed into the water. It must not be touched anymore. Then, this Ukrainian boat departs from the area. Now we can see it picking up speed again, traveling significantly faster than it was before. And the area we just saw was this area here. That means here we have the large river course, and on this side up here, Ukraine. Here is a Russian boat approaching on the Russian-held side. And you can see that quite well too. The small boat we just saw, which was half submerged in the water, can be seen on the far left here. That means the Russian speedboat, the Russian army boat, is now approaching that spot. And we will shortly observe that it indeed triggers one of these dangerous mines, leading to a catastrophic and devastating explosion on the unfortunate Russian boat's side. There we can see it clearly once more in the zoom. That means a truly massive and powerful explosion, which most likely also resulted in the sinking of this particular Russian boat. Why? Because the Ukrainians are now also mining this large river, which essentially represents the front. And it's quite interesting to see that we don't just have mined front sections where, for example, in Zaporizhzhia, the fronts aren't shifting much, where Ukraine isn't retreating and Russians aren't advancing, but also where the Dnipro River is mined at certain key points. Let's go ahead and take a look at the entire situation on the map to better visualize it spatially. Here we have the shore, the Dnipro Delta, and we can see quite clearly indeed that the Russian side is naturally situated in the south, while the Ukrainian-held side is located in the north. And what we just saw, the footage is directly from here. So the last island almost in front of the mainland on Ukraine. We can already see the orange, the marking, which means these are indeed places where fighting is taking place, even if it's hard to imagine. Because you think, yes, the Russians will likely stay on their mainland side, but no, even these little islands are contested, with the Russians trying to get as close as they can there, so that you can also station or position FPV drone teams there, for example. Because we see up there, those are the 12 kilometers that we see here. That means if you can station a team here, then you have about this area within the Ukrainian-held region of Kherson under FPV drone control. That's why the Russians approach very close, attempting to position their troops on the mainland of the northern shore, but they need boats to supply them. And that's exactly what the Ukrainians have just taken advantage of, that they targeted one of these supply ships, one of the small boats which supplied the island with ammunition and essential food, were attacked and completely destroyed with a mine that was strategically placed in the river.